There is no war without propaganda. It produces images of the enemy, stirs up fear, feelings of revenge, and guilt. It fights with exaggerations, with slogans and lies. Its weapons are the mass media. The power of moving pictures, initially tested in the First World War. Radio and film with sound gave propaganda completely new possibilities.
Amerikanische Sherman-Panzer brechen in ein von Infanteristen und Fallschirmjägern gehaltenes Dorf ein. Ein deutscher Kriegsberichter filmt den Panzereinbruch aus unmittelbarer Nähe.
Television brings war into living rooms.
Good morning, greeting to the Viet Cong for the B-52.
In the age of the internet, it is not the lack of, but the abundance of information that makes it easy for propagandists and difficult for the truth. The war as a great adventure, skillfully staged by Nazi propaganda with images and sound. Even more than radio and the press, the newsreel became the most important instrument of psychological mass influence for war propaganda.
One can say that from 1939 on, a radical swing in politics took place. From the very first days of the war, the newsreel declared the measure of all things.
Nur die besten Soldaten der Welt werden auch mit diesen ungeheuren Schwierigkeiten fertig.
The newsreel was part of an ever-growing propaganda apparatus which directed and monitored all areas of public life from the outset with the aim of spiritual mobilization.
Nazi propaganda naturally accompanied every important political action. Propaganda wasn't the icing on the cake, the garnish, but propaganda was skillfully inserted into everything.
Joseph Goebbels was head of propaganda. He established the Führer as a brand and paved the way to power for the National Socialists.
Was wäre diese Bewegung ohne die Propaganda geworden? Und wohin geriete unser Staat, wenn nicht eine wirklich schöpferische Propaganda ihm heute noch das geistige Gesicht gäbe?
All media was used for propaganda purposes. The censorship of the Ministry of Propaganda determined how the war was presented to the public.
After this threshold character of the First World War, the first big war, which was also completely oriented from the outset on all sides to the media, was the Second War. There were all kinds of wars in between, but this was the great media war.
Nazi propaganda fueled anti-Semitic and racially ideological images of the enemy. With the invasion of Poland, Jews there were particularly targeted.
One of the great forefathers of propaganda research formulated one of these core statements for political propaganda. He said that there must be no doubt in the public mind about how the public has to hate. Propaganda must always start by defining an enemy.
Das schwierigste Problem, vor das sich unsere Zivilverwaltung in den besetzten Gebieten gestellt sieht, ist die Judenfrage. Aus diesen Ghetto-Kaschemmen ist auf deutsche Soldaten geschossen worden.
As long as German troops were victorious, war propaganda had an easy time of it. Defeats were reinterpreted and covered up, and the leadership didn't shy away from threatening its own people.
Wer ihren abkämpft, kann damit das Leben für sich und seine Lieben retten. Wer der Nation aber fein oder charakterlos in den Rücken fällt, wird unter allen Umständen eines schrecklichen Todes sterben.
Even when faced with defeat, Nazi propaganda set its sights on victory until the very end. It helped the National Socialists seize power, but it couldn't prevent the downfall of the Third Reich.
War propaganda was not a fourth branch of the armed forces. It was not an independent means of combat, but it always functioned in connection with the military means. It could reinforce victories and it could try to minimize defeats, but it couldn't have a decisive effect on the war because it remained dependent on military successes.
Even the first election campaigns of the National Socialists resembled propaganda campaigns. Joseph Goebbels, who had a doctorate in German studies, used all the modern means of communication to ensure that the chaotic movement became one of the best organized parties in the country.
Ein ganzes Volk ist entschlossen, das System zu brechen.
He took his cue from contemporary business advertising. When he came to Berlin in 1926 as Gauleiter, he saw daily how this business advertising worked. The 1920s were the heyday of advertising. American models had been adopted. They brought them to the capital, Berlin. It included visual advertising, light advertising. It was all very modern and very exciting at the time. And Goebbels obviously got his education there.
Goebbels perfected the art of political propaganda. After an attempted coup in the 1920s failed, the party now wanted to seize power democratically. With its modern methods, the young party was completely up to date.
Die ersten systematischen Studien zur Propaganda, die wurden sozusagen im Mutterland.
The first systematic studies of propaganda started in the motherland of democracies, the United States, where systematic work was done to ensure that democracy didn't get out of hand in the interests of those in power.
Jeweils Mächtigen aus dem Ruder läuft.
Always stay on top of the enemy was the motto of the brown shirts. Trained orators made inflammatory speeches. Thugs mobbed Jewish passers-by on the street and disrupted competing election events. Any means was justified to gain the attention of the masses.
It was all prepared and planned by the SA thugs. And for this purpose, the appropriate means, that is clubs, were also prepared, so that these brawls, which were then also reported in the newspapers, and also about the contents of the speeches, had an effect that was effective in the media.
Some ran with it because their beliefs coincided with those of the party. Others because they were afraid to go against the party. The propaganda of the National Socialists was by no means a surefire success.
It always worked in the context of the use of violence, with the statement, "We are the stronger ones, we will conquer the streets, we, not the weak bourgeois parties, will fight the dangerous left-wing forces."
At the beginning of 1933, the party had reached its goal. For a feature film, the Ministry of Propaganda had a camera-ready reenactment of Adolf Hitler taking power in Germany. The glorification of its own history became an effective instrument of mass manipulation.
Propaganda
must creep into the emotional realm, so that anything that permeates into emotions and blocks thinking as much as possible is good for propaganda.
A few weeks after the National Socialists took power, the Reich Ministry for Popular Enlightenment and Propaganda was created. As the minister in charge, Joseph Goebbels gained extensive control over cultural life and the media.
Parteigenossen! Eine gute Regierung ohne Propaganda kann ebenso wenig bestehen wie eine gute Propaganda ohne eine gute Regierung.
Hitler did not recognize the military restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. Soon, the earlier defensive posture of the army changed. The Reichswehr was renamed the Wehrmacht and was massively reinforced, and the Reichswehr minister became the Minister of War.
Eine gewaltige deutsche Luftwaffe schützt unsere Heimat, eine neue Macht zur See unserer Küsten. Inmitten der gigantischen Steigerung unserer allgemeinen Produktion wurde es möglich, eine Aufrüstung ohne Weichen fortzuführen. Jede Institution dieses Reiches steht unter dem Befehl der obersten politischen Führung und alle Institutionen dieses Reiches sind verschworen und einig in dem Willen und Entschluss, dieses nationalsozialistische Deutschland zu vertreten und wenn notwendig zu verteidigen bis zum letzten Atemzug.
Tag um Tag verlassen Massen von Panzern die deutschen Rüstungswerke.
Man kann rückblicken, strategisch.
In retrospect, one can recognize strategic decisions in the area of war preparation.
Es wird nie von dem großen Weltkrieg geredet, sondern
There was never any talk of a major world war, but rather of limited conflicts and of being prepared to see them through, which was of course important in such situations, for example the so-called liberation of the Rhineland.
der sogenannten Rheinlandbefreiung.
Deutsche Truppen beziehen wieder ihre Friedensgarnison in der ungeschützten Zone. Jubelnde Begeisterung in Düsseldorf.
Hitler
considered the situation particularly dangerous because he assumed that the Allies would invade, would react. When they didn't, he concluded that he would be allowed to continue.
Nazi leaders like Hermann Göring went to great lengths for propaganda purposes to suggest to the nation that there was now full support for Hitler.
Adolf Hitler, unser geliebter Führer, erfüllte das Vermächtnis der 2 Millionen, die ihr Leben auf Deutschland ließen. Deutschland ist wieder eins geworden, wieder ein Volk untrennbar verbunden, in Not und Leid, in Glück und Freude.
It was the beginning of a ruthless raid through Europe. The nation was being openly prepared for a new war.
Until 1938, Hitler had always given the impression that he was pursuing a policy of peace. This was then radically changed in early 1939. Now the propaganda was altered so that the population had to know that a war was imminent, and that even expressing skepticism about a war, which might have been tolerated earlier, would now also be persecuted by the regime.
On January 30th, 1939, exactly 6 years after coming to power, the Führer finally took off the mask of peacefulness in the Reichstag.
Ich will heute wieder ein Prophet sein. Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
With their personal oath to the Führer, even soldiers critical of Hitler felt obliged to the regime and, starting in 1939, went to war for the Führer and the fatherland. A lie provided the necessary justification for the long-planned attack.
When wars start, each side tries to present itself as the one attacked. We acted in self-defense, and the other side is the aggressor. And this is understandably assisted with staging, with lies. In the Second World War, there was the fictitious attack on Gleiwitz Station by alleged Polish volunteers, which was in reality an SS commando operation. This incident happened at 5:45 a.m., and then they returned fire.
Polen hat heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit bereits regulären Soldaten geschossen. Seit 5:45 Uhr wird jetzt zurückgeschossen. Und von jetzt ab wird Bombe mit Bombe vergolten.
To this day, it was a coup for Nazi propaganda. The opening of the barrier on the Polish border became a symbol for the beginning of World War II. The newsreel intensified the anti-Polish resentment that existed in large parts of the German population.
Der Feldzug in Polen hat uns Gelegenheit gegeben, das Judentum an seiner Niststätte kennenzulernen. Fast 4 Millionen Juden leben hier in Polen. Dieses ostjüdische Untermenschentum hat seit jeher Westeuropa das internationale Verbrechergesindel geliefert. Von hier aus wurden die Demokratien mit Taschendieben, Zuhältern, Rauschgift- und Mädchenhändlern, internationalen Bankschiebern und Hetzjournalisten versorgt.
The start of the war posed new challenges for propaganda. The mood among the people became a new important field of activity, as well as the future handling of the increasing number of foreign workers. However, the most important task still remained: war reporting.
Der ganze Apparat braucht ein paar Wochen.
The whole apparatus needed a few weeks to adjust to the new situation. They had a balancing act to perform. On the one hand, they had to respond to the current situation, and on the other hand, they had to keep an eye on long-term developments. And as long as the German armies were victorious on all fronts, this balancing act was not very difficult because they were counting on victory.
Expansion in the West began in early May 1940. Barely 4 weeks later, France capitulated. The term Blitzkrieg, which had already been used to describe the attack on Poland, became synonymous with success. Private film of the Führer's visit to occupied Paris. Shortly thereafter, Hitler returned to the Reich Chancellery as a glorious commander. All of Nazi Germany was ecstatic with victory.
The war against France was, of course, one triumphant story for propaganda. In those pictures, you see shots of him driving his Mercedes along streets covered with flowers, and you see enthusiastic young people. But we happen to have the deployment plan for this reception, and there you can trace in minute detail how these images were created and how the whole thing was staged, how the various party formations were lined up along the streets all morning, and how, at a certain point in time, BDM girls and Hitler boys then began to scatter the flowers over the streets over which the Mercedes would drive.
From the very beginning, Hitler's appearances are staged. In the film Triumph of the Will from the Party Congress in 1934 in Nuremberg, Leni Riefenstahl made the dictator appear like a messiah.
Nicht der Staat befiehlt uns, sondern wir befehlen dem Staate.
Riefenstahl's staging became the model for Hitler's appearances.
If you look at how the newsreel shows Adolf Hitler's entry into Danzig and later into Warsaw, the original is Riefenstahl, and that's not by chance. The cameramen, they are Riefenstahl cameramen who know how to do it because they have done it before, namely in Triumph of the Will.
Riefenstahl's film promoted the legend of Hitler as a charismatic leader. How the people got to see him was important to Hitler from the very beginning. He rehearsed gestures and speech patterns and meticulously controlled all images that appeared in the media.
Hitler himself, for example, asked to see all the photos with him before they were submitted to the press. That's why we only ever saw him in 5 or 6 different stereotypical poses. That was his standard pose. He didn't allow anything else.
Home movies like these only became public after the war. Munich photographer Heinrich Hoffmann shaped Hitler's public image with his portraits of the Führer and thus contributed significantly to his rise to power.
He was Hitler's personal photographer. He was also an enormously successful media entrepreneur in the 1920s and 30s. So the Hitler image, the National Socialist image, would be completely unimaginable without his pictures.
After the war, the personal photographer had to stand trial. At his sentencing at the Munich Court of Arbitration in January 1947, the presiding judge Josef Purzer emphasized Hoffmann's importance.
Ihre Werke sind meisterhaft und die Psychose, die im deutschen Volk entstanden ist, die wird sehr wesentlich auf diese Bildberichterstattung, auf diese Verherrlichung Hitlers zurückgeführt, denn alles das, was angeblich schön und groß an diesen Menschen war, ist hier dargestellt worden. Die Wirklichkeit sah allerdings ganz anders aus. Und an dieser Täuschung des Volkes hat Ihr Verlag ganz wesentlich mitgewirkt.
He disagreed with that, saying he only took the pictures. That's true, of course, but taking pictures also meant supporting this regime in pictures, defending it, bringing it into the public eye. To my knowledge, there hasn't been a single other trial in which photographers were prosecuted.
Meines Wissens hat es keinen einzigen anderen Prozess gegeben,
And that has also contributed to the fact that the majority of wartime photographers transitioned fairly smoothly into the post-war media world. And there is no one that I know of who has dealt with this in a critical way.
A year before the outbreak of war, the Ministry of Propaganda and the Wehrmacht concluded an agreement on the implementation of propaganda in war. Propaganda was understood as an equal-ranking method of war.
Propaganda companies were established as early as the 1930s. And the name suggests that there are military structures that clearly serve propaganda. These propaganda companies were directly subordinated to the high command of the Wehrmacht. That means that the orders came from the very top.
More than 15,000 reporters were engaged in the production of military propaganda material. They operated enemy radio stations, launched false reports, and supplied the footage for the newsreels.
Participation was coveted, but also dangerous. Being a photographer on the front line, it was coveted to be a member of the propaganda company. One was embedded in the military units. One enjoyed privileges. But the danger of being killed was much greater. Because, and this is perhaps the most important thing, the staging, the documentation of the war changed fundamentally. In World War I, we actually had a war that had been reenacted behind the lines. During the Second World War, photographs were being taken on the front lines.
The films were intended to draw the viewer directly into the action and conveyed the impression of being an eyewitness account and authentic. Ever since they seized power in 1933, the German people had been sworn in as successors to the heroes of the First World War and the Putsch victims of 1923. Even in the early years of the war, the heroic myth was generally met with a great willingness to believe.
Als einziger Soldat des großen Krieges aber habe ich an die Vorsehung nur eine einzige demutvolle Bitte zu richten. Möge sie uns alle der Gnade teilhaftig werden lassen, das letzte Kapitel des großen Völkerringens für unser deutsches Volk in Ehren abzuschließen. Dann werden sich die Geister der gefallenen Kameraden aus ihren Gräbern erheben und all denen danken, die durch ihren Mut und ihre Treue nunmehr wieder gut machen, was eine einzige schwache Stunde an ihnen und an unserem Volk einst gesündigt hat.
Heroes Remembrance Day, introduced in 1934, replaced the National Day of Mourning and became one of the most important holidays of the Nazi regime.
The myth of the frontline soldier of World War I was, of course, nurtured during the Weimar period. For propaganda purposes, the frontline soldier was always the hero. The hero doesn't die either. He's physically dead, but when we celebrate him, we revive him. He's present in the national community.
Nazi propaganda made the commander-in-chief of the African campaign, Erwin Rommel, the prototype of the hero. The Führer's most frequently filmed battle leader became a kind of media star in the age of newsreels.
Marschall Rommel meldet sich beim Führer und empfängt aus seiner Hand den Marschallstab.
Rommel deftly added the missing glamour to what was actually a minor theater of war in Africa. To kick things off, he had a military parade held in Tripoli. On his orders, the tanks of the small German force rolled around the same block of houses for hours.
First of all, in order to demonstrate a strength that wasn't there, he had these mock tanks built out of wood and canvas and fitted with old chains in the back. And the English actually believed that there were larger German tank formations there than there actually were.
Rommel will go down in history as the Desert Fox. The Ministry of Propaganda sent reporters into the desert to show Rommel in the right light.
Modern ausgebaute Wüstenforts, Feldbefestigungen und Minenfelder schützen die britische Front. Marschall Rommel hat den Entschluss zum überraschenden Angriff auf die 8. britische Armee gefasst. Wie immer befindet er sich unmittelbar bei der kämpfenden Truppe
For the newsreel, Rommel was allowed to field divisions that he never had at his disposal. The war-weary cinema audiences at home were happy to see it.
At that time, it was a gift for the Reich Ministry of Propaganda. It was a way to cover up the situation in Russia.
1 year later, Rommel was commander-in-chief inspecting the invasion front in France. But even he couldn't stop the American invasion.
Auf die neue Bewaffnung und die Kampfmittel, die uns in die Hand gegeben sind, können wir den kommenden Ereignissen mit größter Ruhe entgegensehen und brauchen uns keine Sekunde den Kopf zu brechen, gut oder schlecht geht. Es geht bestimmt gut.
Rommel had long suspected that the war was lost. Although Hitler's former favorite general was still being celebrated at propaganda events, his relationship with the Führer was becoming more strained.
Rommel was very good with the media. He was also popular. That's what we know today. He was so popular that the political leadership wanted to put him out of action again, because it's dangerous when someone like that gets out of hand. He must not become too popular.
After the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in 1944, Rommel was caught up in the purges. The leaders of the coup were shot. Surviving conspirators were relentlessly persecuted. Rommel also came under suspicion and was pushed into committing suicide. Official mourning hypocritically staged for the newsreels.
In einem Staatsakt nimmt das deutsche Volk Abschied von einem seiner tapfersten Generale. Mit ihm, so sagte der Führer in einem Tagesbefehl, ist einer unserer besten Heerführer dahingegangen. Sein Name ist im gegenwärtigen Schicksalskampf des deutschen Volkes der Begriff für hervorragende Tapferkeit und unerschrockenes Draufgängertum geworden.
In order not to damage the reputation of one of the few popular heroes, a connection to the assassination was avoided as much as possible. Since the beginning of the war, the propaganda ministry had grown into a huge apparatus with several thousand employees. Despite the wartime economy, the budget had increased more than tenfold, but its size also brought disadvantages. Many propaganda campaigns, especially abroad, had little effect.
Of course, attempts were also made to influence other countries, but the regime's foreign policy set very narrow limits. In other words, some of the propaganda was based on an almost grotesque misjudgment of the situation in certain countries, so that it largely missed its target audience.
The responsibility for foreign propaganda repeatedly led to heated disputes between the Reich Foreign Ministry, the Wehrmacht, and propaganda minister Goebbels.
He never had that all-powerful position. The military wouldn't allow that to happen. He never had that total authority for propaganda. There were propaganda troops, but Hitler never gave Goebbels a free hand in the military arena, and the military never allowed it.
Goebbels was still left with the task of making the war-weary population aware of the next attack in June 1941.
Deutsches Volk, in diesem Augenblick vollzieht sich ein Aufmarsch, der in Ausdehnung und Umfang der größte ist, den die Welt bisher gesehen hat. Von Ostpreußen bis zu den Karpaten reichen die Formationen der deutschen Ostfront. Ich habe mich deshalb heute entschlossen, das Schicksal und die Zukunft des Deutschen Reiches und unseres Volkes wieder in die Hand unserer Soldaten zu legen.
An unprecedented war of extermination began against the alleged Bolshevik world conspiracy. But right from the start, Nazi propaganda failed to inspire the people with the same enthusiasm for the campaign in the East as they had for the West earlier. People's skepticism about the regime's pronouncements grew. Berlin experienced the most air raids during the Second World War. Due to the heavy bombardments, the city center in particular was reduced to rubble by the end of the war. Out of concern for social unrest and declining war morale, a normality in everyday life was to be maintained as long as possible. The air raids increased. More and more often, people had to spend grueling nights crammed into air raid shelters and basements of houses.
Im Befehlsstand der Luftverteidigung Berlin. Es wird ein Terrorangriff der britisch-amerikanischen Luftpiraten auf die Reichshauptstadt erwartet.
Images not seen in the newsreel. In 1943 alone, more than 700,000 Berliners fled the Reich capital. Tens of thousands of bombed-out people had to be housed in emergency quarters.
The propagandists traveled to the destroyed cities and faced the situation by not trivializing it, by saying this is great damage that has occurred. The Allied bombers were then defamed as terror bombers. That was very clear. But you showed empathy. That was very important.
In the second half of the war, Goebbels, as Gauleiter of Berlin, recognized very well that it was of no use in constantly claiming everything was fine and that we will win, but that one must solve the problems that the war brings to the people. As Gauleiter of Berlin, for example, he was responsible for feeding the population. And if there was no fresh fruit for months, it was his fault. So he had to try to satisfy the population materially.
Eine Luftschutzhelferin erstattet dem Minister Bericht.
Es ist ein Irrtum anzunehmen, dass
It's a mistake to assume that propaganda works only when it shows the beautiful side, but rather when it acknowledges reality.
der Anteil des korrekt
The proportion of what's being communicated must be large enough that the rest, which ignores reality, is also accepted. So propaganda needs a grain, a spark of truth.
Die Propaganda braucht ein Kernchen, ein Fünkchen an Nicht-Konstruktion.
It's an underestimation of propagandists to assume that propaganda is just manipulation and lies.
Nur Manipulation und Lüge sei.
The German advance in the Soviet Union stalled. Hitler ordered an offensive, but the emaciated units in the front got stuck in snowdrifts, contrary to what the propaganda portrayed.
War propaganda always worked brilliantly and smoothly when there were great military successes. Things got bad when the military successes didn't materialize or when defeats were at stake. In the winter crisis of 1941-42, when the German armies were bogged down in the east, it was impossible for weeks to find out from the propaganda where the fronts really were. And that, of course, increased the fears of the population.
Südwestlich von Moskau greifen die Panzer der Gruppe Guderian an. Die Bolschewiken hatten auch hier die Dörfer zu festungsartigen Stützpunkten ausgebaut, die zähe und hartnäckig gekämpft werden musste. Die deutschen Infanteristen, Pioniere und Panzerschützen zeigten sich auch hier den Sowjets kämpferisch weit überlegen.
The same applied to the winter crisis of 42-43, where the catastrophic situation of the Sixth Army in Stalingrad was concealed by propaganda. This, too, was another example that by concealing facts, an effect was achieved that ran precisely counter to the regime's intentions.
In early 1943, the remnants of General Paulus's Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad. For the German public, the news of total defeat on the Volga was a shock. Just a few weeks earlier, Hitler had bragged that the city had already been taken. Propaganda Minister Goebbels saw an opportunity to boost the war effort in his own way.
After Stalingrad, propaganda changed. Goebbels tried to eliminate this negative mood by multiplying the propagandistic campaigns. It was then no longer ideology that was spread. It was no longer just a view of the world, but it was the very concrete involvement of each individual to make them jointly responsible for what the regime did.
Indem mitverantwortlich wird für das, was das Regime tut.
Engländer behaupten, das deutsche Volk wehrt sich gegen die totalen Kriegsmaßnahmen der Regierung. Es will nicht den totalen Krieg, sagen die Engländer, sondern die Kapitulation. Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg?
Goebbels also attempted to use atrocity propaganda, such as the pictures taken of Soviet atrocities against the population after they crossed the border into East Prussia for the first time.
Geschändete Frauen, erschlagene Greise, ermordete Kinder. Mit den entmenschten Horden des Bolschewismus kam über diese Ortschaft Raub, Brand und Tod. Diese Dokumente einer bestialischen Grausamkeit mögen eine letzte Warnung an Europa sein.
But that too proved to be a blunt weapon in the propaganda campaign, because people tended to react with horror, with the feeling that the war had to somehow end. It couldn't go on like this.
The Minister of Propaganda himself traveled to the threatened areas in order to spread his fanaticism among his fellow countrymen.
Jene Divisionen, die jetzt schon zu kleinen Offensiven angetreten sind und in den nächsten Wochen und Monaten zu Großoffensiven antreten werden, werden in diesen Kampf hineingehen wie in einen Gottesdienst. Und wenn sie ihre Gewehre schultern und ihre Panzerfahrzeuge besteigen, dann haben sie nur ihre erschlagenen Kinder und geschändeten Frauen vor Augen, und ein Schrei der Rache wird aus ihren Kehlen emporsteigen, vor dem der Feind erblassen wird.
The longer the war lasted, the more important the morale on the home front became. To keep the population happy, the radio constantly expanded its entertainment programs.
Der Deutsche Rundfunk sendete von Berlin aus das 50. Wunschkonzert für die Wehrmacht. Seit Oktober 1939 wurden im Rahmen dieser Veranstaltungen fast 45.000 Wünsche von Soldaten und Wehrmachtseinheiten erfüllt.
Since 1940, a standard program had been broadcast by all Reich stations. After the defeat at Stalingrad, Goebbels had the proportion of entertainment programs increased to more than 80% of programming. In addition to radio, film also played a decisive role in Nazi propaganda until the very end. Goebbels considered it one of the most modern means of influencing the masses. As late as 1945, 12 new feature films were released.
The idea was that viewers wouldn't have to be persuaded to go to the films, but that they would go because they wanted to see them. From the very beginning, Goebbels in particular wanted German film to remain attractive, both nationally and internationally.
Propaganda Minister Goebbels even accepted unpopular content for this purpose. In Dance on the Volcano, he criticized the positive depiction of a coup. Der Alten Fritz, on the other hand, was considered less propagandistic and was even shown after 1945. With the onset of the war, film guidelines changed.
Anti-British films were demanded and produced. Anti-Semitic films were demanded and produced. Anti-Polish, anti-Soviet films were produced on a scale that would have been simply unthinkable before 1939.
A clip from the film The Eternal Jew, which was supposed to get the Germans in the mood for the planned final solution to the Jewish question.
Sie sind hinterlistig, feige und grausam und treten meist in großen Scharen auf. Sie stellen unter den Tieren das Element der heimtückischen unterirdischen Zerstörung dar. Nicht anders als die Juden unter den Menschen.
While schools and theaters had long since closed, cinemas were kept running until the end of the war despite the most difficult conditions. In early 1945, one of Goebbels' favorite projects was shown on the big screen. The film Kolberg was supposed to strengthen the fighting morale of the population. As in the script, the Germans were supposed to withstand the enemy siege.
Kolberg is a good example of how film propaganda cannot work. The film was supposed to be based on the memory of the heroic defensive attitude of the population of Kolberg during the Napoleonic Wars. It was supposed to strengthen the will of the population to resist. But by the time the film was finished, Kolberg had already been overrun by the Red Army, and that didn't save the will to resist in 1945.
Nettelbeck, wie lange glauben Sie, halten wir das noch aus?
Wenn es sein muss, noch eine ganze Weile, Herr Kommandant. Die Häuser können uns verbrennen, unsere Erde nicht.
When Polish troops conquered the town of Kolberg, the film was drowned out by the laughter of the audiences in Berlin cinemas, while screenings of the fairy tale film Munchausen were sold out in the embattled capital. The most expensive and lavish film of the Nazi era was a flop. In the newsreel, life in bombed-out Berlin was still bearable. The Red Army was 90 kilometers from the city limits. Nazi propaganda tried to prepare the people for the worst with slogans about holding out.
Auch der Luftterror kann die Menschen nicht in ihrer Gläubigkeit erschüttern. Je größer die Not, umso härter ist ihr Wille. Sie sind entschlossen, ihre Stadt mit äußerstem Fanatismus gegen den Feind zu verteidigen. Berliner Volkssturm ist aufgeboten und setzt in unermüdlicher Arbeit die Reichshauptstadt in Verteidigungszustand. Männer, Frauen und Jugendliche wissen, dass ihre Heimatstadt vor einer tödlichen Bedrohung steht. Mit Trotz und Fanatismus sind sie bereit, jede Straße und jedes Haus wie ihr heiligstes Besitztum zu schützen.
The population, as suggested by the images of the Ministry of Propaganda, was firmly behind the Führer.
We still have an image before us today, I think, that the Allied bombing of German cities didn't cause the morale of the population to collapse. And I think that this image was very much influenced by Goebbels' propaganda. And one should be very careful not to draw far-reaching conclusions about the real attitude of the population from these images of people cheering.
But not everything that the propaganda companies delivered was credible enough to find its way into movie theaters.
Na Kameraden, ihr habt euch ja hier eine prima Villa gebaut, oder?
Ja, schauen wir da, das ist ein Ding.
Wo sind Sie denn zu Hause?
Ich aus Berlin-Charlottenburg.
Berlin-Charlottenburg, ja? Weiß denn Ihre Frau, dass Sie hier sind?
Na, im Augenblick ist sie noch sehr im Zweifel.
Ja?
Ja, die ist jetzt weggekommen. Jetzt in Lübeck, bei Lübeck muss ungefähr liegen.
Na, wollen wir sehen, dass Sie auch noch hier sind?
Ja, hoffentlich sieht sie mich hier.
Bist du wohl, der Eil ist noch ganz in Ordnung. Und sonst, der Russe lässt euch hier in Ruhe, was?
Ach, am Einermann geht's. Der zittert mehr wie wir. Ja, stimmt, da kann man sagen.
The footage of the relaxed soldiers would not be shown publicly after all. In the event of defeat, Hitler had a cynical explanation. The German people simply did not have the inner wherewithal that had been attributed to them, he declared before a meeting of Gauleiters. Shortly thereafter, Nazi propaganda portrayed the dictator once again as a hopeful commander. It was his last public appearance.
Der Führer empfängt in seinem Hauptquartier den Reichsjugendführer Axmann mit einer Abordnung von 20 Hitlerjungen, die sich bei der Verteidigung ihrer Heimat besonders bewährt haben und dafür mit dem Eisernen Kreuz ausgezeichnet wurden.
We still tend to take these images of the great propaganda successes of the National Socialists at face value, and we don't see the staging behind it. It is material that was created or sorted out in the Ministry of Propaganda. It's Goebbels' attempt to show that I have been the most successful propaganda man in the entire history of the world. Here is the evidence.
The images of the end of the Third Reich were no longer determined by Goebbels' propaganda, but by photographs taken by Soviet cameramen. The storming of Berlin was no longer suitable for jubilant images. Shortly before Hitler's death in the bunker marked the end of the regime, Joseph Goebbels gave a final radio address.
Verteidiger Berlins, auf euch sind die Blicke eurer Frauen, eurer Mütter und eurer Kinder gerichtet. Unser Ziel ist die Freiheit unseres Volkes und ein Reich der sozialen Gerechtigkeit in einer kommenden glücklichen Zukunft.
Hold out until the final victory was Joseph Goebbels' slogan. He was one of the last to still believe his own propaganda.
The propagandists-in-chief themselves, who invented this idea that a totally controlled propaganda system was the best media landscape, had to realize afterwards that it didn't work. This, then, is something that changed at least a little bit after the Second World War. The idea that guiding alone would do it no longer prevailed.
Now, the propaganda of the victors is at work. For history, the raising of the Soviet flag was reenacted on camera.